Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. The room is not full, but I'm also being told that this will be also broadcasted online, so I'm sure there are others who are listening to our session. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm Achala Besingha. I'm the Director and Head of Programs of Asia program at Global Green Growth Institute. This session is on building resilience in developing countries through addressing loss and damage due to climate impacts. Let me start by saying this. I think majority of you are from South Korea. On 8th of August 2022, there were large-scale floods hitting the capital of South Korea, Seoul. It started with highest rainfall that was reported in 80 years. As a result, 2,800 buildings were damaged, and at least 9 people lost their lives. 50 cities and towns were issued with landslide warnings. Power cuts were widespread. The floods resulted in more than 150 billion Korean won of insured loss. This is only insured loss. This is around 115 million US dollars. And as I said, this is only insured loss, and we don't know the numbers of non-insured losses. Last year also, Pakistan had severe floods. The damage and losses are calculated to be around over 30 billion US dollars in terms of economic losses. And World Bank also assessed that the reconstruction needs of the country in Pakistan is over 16 billion US dollars. Italy last week had serious floods and still in the immediate recovery mode. In terms of getting back to normalcy, we don't know how long it will take. So all these are just related to floods, but also there are so many other consequences, impacts related to climate change, impacting people, communities, and ecosystems all around the world. So this issue has become serious, extremely important to be addressed in an urgent manner. So let me say a few words about this session and also introduce Global Green Growth Institute. We are an intergovernmental organization led by His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, who is the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations. And we do have around 45 member countries now and around 37 offices in the world. And our work is focusing on building a resilient world of strong, inclusive, and sustainable growth. And without addressing climate-related loss and damage, we will not be able to achieve our vision or to support our countries to achieve their own vision. And our mission is to foster a global shift towards green growth with a focus on country-specific strategies and harmoniously drive poverty reduction, social inclusion, and also environmental sustainability and economic growth. As I mentioned, we have 45 member countries, and we do support the countries and help them to address climate change as well as their green growth aspirations. And our offices are embedded in ministries in the governments of developing countries, and therefore we have a very hands-on day-to-day work with our governments. Now, coming back to loss and damage issue, I'm sure my panelists will go through some of the points that I'm going to present here, but just very briefly mention that this is, in terms of climate action, the understanding is that there are limits to what we can do through mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as adapting and building resilience. In terms of mitigation, it is linked to carbon emissions reductions, and it is also pre-disaster related. And key actions include introducing and bringing in renewable energy options such as solar, wind power, and as well as hydropower, retrofitting buildings or building new buildings that are energy efficient, as well as sustainable land use and conservation practices. When it comes to adaptation, adaptation is linked to transforming and adjusting ways of living. And this, in terms of the timing, it is linked to pre-disasters and building resilience, as well as building resilience of infrastructure and systems, and bringing in systems like early warning systems and emergency preparedness are some of the key activities related to this. Ecosystem-based adaptation is a key area now that countries are considering, especially bringing in nature-based solutions such as protecting forest, mangroves, and peatlands in our countries. Now, coming to loss and damage issue, this is mainly disaster-focused, sudden and slow onset events, and it is also linked to pre- and post-disasters. And I'm sure you know the Paris Agreement is the first ever multilateral treaty that has brought in this idea to be addressed at the multilateral level, at global level. And there are a number of activities related to it that we have listed here, and my panelists will also go into discussing what those are. Let me not go into this one, but focus on here what the needs and where are we today in terms of addressing those loss and damage needs. There are 4 key areas that we have recognized. Those include research and capacity building, policy, financing, and technology. Again, I'm not going to go through every single word here. I'm sure my colleagues, Salim would give a broad overview of these needs, whereas my other colleagues will come in terms of specific needs that we have identified here on this slide. Now, why is this linked to global peace and prosperity? Why are we doing a session on climate impacts and disasters, and related to those disasters and impacts are loss and damage? Why are we talking about losses and damages? Because it actually is very strongly linked to socio-economic stability of so many countries and communities, because loss and damage can severely disrupt socio-economic stability in the regions, like what I mentioned in South Korea, in Seoul, when we had the floods, in Pakistan, when there was this serious flood last year. It is also linked to conflicts. The more we address loss and damage, the more we prevent conflicts related to climate impacts. And then it is also linked to environmental security. Environmental degradation, resource scarcity, and climate-related vulnerabilities are strongly linked to loss and damage. The more we address loss and damage, the more secure our environment becomes. And then overall, it is also linked to global cooperation and solidarity. Because the climate change problem is a global issue, same as the overall climate change issue. The loss and damage issue is also becoming a global issue, because when the communities are affected, there will also be migration across countries. You may have heard that there is a serious migration issue between Africa and Europe now, and it is not only linked to conflicts and socio-economic situations of those countries, but also related to climate impacts. And therefore, the more we address loss and damage, the more we address global cooperation and also show solidarity with those affected communities and countries. Now, it brings me to this very important slide to introduce my distinguished panelists to take what I introduced to the next level. They are the most qualified to talk about this issue. Let me start with Dr. Salimul Haq, actually Professor Salimul Haq, who is also my guru. He brought me into the climate change world, introduced me to this climate change arena, and he is known as the guru when it comes to loss and damage. He's the director of International Center for Climate Adaptation and Development, based in Bangladesh, and also linked to Independent University Bangladesh, IUB. And as I mentioned, he is a top influencer on climate change policy, and he has also received a prestigious honors such as the Order of the British Empire. And he has chaired the expert advisory group for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and he also a senior advisor on locally led adaptation with the Global Climate Adaptation Program. He's renowned for his expertise in climate change adaptation in vulnerable developing countries. When the Paris Agreement was negotiated, he was again the most influential and powerful friend to the least developed countries and small island developing states, particularly championing this issue of loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. And if you Google, you will come across so many publications that Professor Haq has done, not only on loss and damage issue, but on so many other issues. Thank you, Salim, for joining us. Let me now hand over to you, and then I will go to the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Achala, and good evening to everybody. I'd like to first thank the Korean government, particularly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for inviting me to participate in the Jeju Forum and in this session. Also to the Green Growth Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, for organizing this session and inviting me as well. I'm going to make 3 sets of remarks. First at the global level, then at the regional level for the Asia-Pacific region, and then at the national and local level for all the countries in the world, in fact. The global message is actually a very bad message, in that we have failed, despite our attempts, to prevent climate change from happening. It is now happening, unfortunately. And nobody in the world is ready for it. Nobody is prepared. Not poor countries, not rich countries. You heard a few examples from Achala about impacts in Korea, impacts in Italy, impacts in Canada right now. There are wildfires and people being evacuated in Canada. Every country is going to be affected. And we have now entered what I call the era of impacts from human-induced climate change, because global temperature has gone well above 1 degree. We're probably going to cross 1.5 degrees within the next few years. And we need to be ready for it, but we are not ready for it. So that's the number one message. Now, at the global level, there are 2 big areas of information and policy making that we need to keep track of. The information comes from the scientific community, and this comes through what we call the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body co-organized by the World Meteorological Organization, which is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, and the United Nations Environment Program, which is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. Together, they bring together governments, that's the Intergovernmental Panel, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change then brings together scientists from all over the world. And the scientific community has grown enormously to many thousands of scientists who are involved in the IPCC assessment reports. And every few years, the IPCC produces an assessment report on the science of climate change. And this is done every 5-6 years. And they have just completed and published the 6th assessment report in the last 30 years. So it's the 6th time they have done the assessment report. The report comes out in 3 volumes or 3 groups. Group 1, Working Group 1, is on the science, the climate models. What are they saying? What are they telling us? The scientists who run climate models, global circulation models, they study that and tell us. Then the working group 2, which I used to belong to, is on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation. What are the impacts going to be? Which countries are vulnerable? And how can they adapt to the impacts of climate change? And I was a lead author in IPCC Working Group 2 for the 3rd assessment report, the 4th assessment report, and the 5th assessment report, but not the last one, the 6th assessment, which has just come. I did a long time in the IPCC, and I didn't participate in the last assessment. And then Working Group 3, which is on solutions. What do we do about the problem? On mitigation, reducing emissions, on adaptation, actions to tackle climate change. And then once all 3 reports are done, there is a synthesis report that brings together the messages from all 3 reports. We have just finished, as I said, the 6th assessment report, and there are 2 very important messages that have come out of it that are new. The first message from Working Group 1, which, as I said, these are climate scientists. They're very conservative. They don't do politics. They just study the atmosphere, and they study the percentage of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the trajectory of those gases. For the first time ever, they said they can now unequivocally show the impacts because of the rising temperature since the Industrial Revolution. The temperature has gone up more than 1 degree, 1.1, 1.2, it varies from place to place, but in the order of 1.1 to 1.2 already. And the WMO just recently had a report saying we will cross 1.5, which is the threshold in the Paris Agreement we agreed not to cross, but unfortunately we will cross in the next few years. And so the temperature has risen, and we can now attribute, this is the key scientific observation. In the past, we said this will happen, but we can't say it's because it's climate change. Now we can say it is happening because of climate change. We can now attribute impacts because of rise in temperature that is attributable to human-induced climate change. It's a big, big breakthrough. The scientists never said that before. It's the first time they said it. Then a few months later, early this year, the Working Group 1 came out the end of last year. Working Group 2 came out early this year, and they came out with a report on impacts. So it's about impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. And they showed hundreds of examples of actual impacts of floods, as we just heard, of heat waves, of long-term droughts, of sea level rise and salinity in low-lying coastal areas. Many hundreds of examples of impacts from human-induced climate change. They're happening, and they're causing losses and damages. When you have those impacts, then they result in loss and damage. Now, let me just say a few words about the phrase loss and damage. What does it mean? The phrase loss and damage itself is a political phrase. It actually it doesn't have a definition, by the way. And one of the reasons it doesn't have a definition is that in order to get the agreement, as Achala said, in the Paris Agreement, we have Article 8 on loss and damage. We got the agreement by not having a definition, so that one side could say, this is what it means to us, and the other side could say, this is what it means to them. And there's no agreed definition. But there is a rough operational definition, which I'll share with you. Roughly, when we say losses, we are talking about things that are completely lost. When a human life is lost, it's gone. We cannot bring it back. No amount of money will bring that back. When biodiversity is lost, when culture is lost, when a country goes underwater, which some island countries will happen, they are lost completely. When it's completely lost, you cannot retrieve it. You cannot bring it back. That's what we call losses. Damages, on the other hand, are things that can be repaired. A road is damaged from the flood, but after the flood is over, we can repair the road. An embankment or a dike can be repaired. A building can be repaired. So damages are things that can be repaired. Losses are things that simply are lost and cannot be got back. On the other hand, there is another phrase that is also applicable but is not allowed in the UN Framework Convention, and I'll come to the UN Framework Convention in a minute, and that is liability and compensation. All right? That's one of the reasons why loss and damage has been a very politically contentious issue in the UN Framework Convention. This is the policy-making arm. So I said the science is the IPCC. They produce scientific reports that inform policy, and then the policy-making is in the UN Framework Convention. Now, the UN Framework Convention started in 1992 in Rio. Every year they have a meeting of all the parties. It's called Conference of Parties, COP. They just had the 27th Conference of Parties in November last year in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we got a very, very important decision in Sharm el-Sheikh after a long battle, discussion, politics, division between the countries on setting up a fund to address loss and damage. Until now, the developed countries, as I said, they did not want to address liability and compensation because then the polluters have to pay. And in the UN Framework Convention, the polluters have to agree to the decision. If they don't agree, we don't get a decision, and we didn't get it for a long time. But in Sharm el-Sheikh, we got the decision. Every country agreed we must address loss and damage because of the IPCC report. It became self-evident. It's happening. We cannot ignore it anymore. We have to do something. So we have all agreed. That's the good news. Now we need to do what we have agreed to do. And that's where we have always faltered. The Paris Agreement was a big agreement. We agreed to keep temperature below 1.5. We haven't been able to do it. Rich countries agreed to give $100 billion a year. They have not done that yet. And so we are good at making agreements, even though they're difficult agreements, but then we don't implement those agreements. So the last comments I'm going to make are about how do we make it happen on the ground. And in my view, the onus for doing that is national governments and regional authorities. So regional groupings of countries in the Asia-Pacific, ASEAN, SAARC in South Asia, and other groupings, Asia-Pacific groupings, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan in this region, developed countries, Korea. We are going to have to work together because it's a global problem and a regional problem. And Asia is a particularly important region because it is the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions come from this region. The majority of the world's population are in this region. And the majority of the world's most vulnerable population are in this region, from small island states in the Pacific to big countries like China, India, and my country, Bangladesh, one of the most vulnerable countries. And so we have a big opportunity, on the one hand, to address the problem before other people address it, because it's a big problem for us. And I'll cite the example of my country, Bangladesh, which is one of the most vulnerable countries. We have taken this issue seriously for some time now, for the last 10 years. We have invested effort in developing our knowledge on the problem, developing adaptation strategies, and particularly focusing on building capacity of the local people in the vulnerable places to know what to do when the impacts happen. And in Bangladesh, I would say we have the best cyclone preparedness program in the whole world. And I'll just cite an example before I end. A few weeks ago, there was a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal coming up to Bangladesh. It's called Mocha. And it was a Category 4 cyclone, which is a bad cyclone, as it was coming to the shore. And it got upgraded to a Category 5, which is a very bad cyclone, a very severe cyclone, because the sea surface temperature was higher than normal. And that is a function of climate change. So the cyclone was not caused by climate change, but it became much more intense because of climate change, because the temperature of the sea surface was higher. And in Bangladesh, we had warnings. We knew it was coming. Around 500,000 people were given warnings. They went to shelters. They were all ready for the cyclone if it hit. Fortunately for us, the cyclone veered east at the last few hours, and it hit Bangladesh, but not the big population area, and it crossed Bangladesh into Myanmar. And in Myanmar, more than 200 people lost their lives because they were not ready. They were not prepared. We were prepared. Fortunately, it didn't hit us in the middle of the central population, but even if it had, our loss of life has been brought down very, very extensively by being better adapted and better prepared. So the whole issue now of how to look at the climate change problem, in my view, as we have now entered what I call the era of losses and damages from climate change, is to reframe what we used to talk about, which was mitigation, that is now averting or avoiding loss and damage. What we used to talk about adaptation, that is now minimizing loss and damage, because adaptation cannot bring it to zero. There's always going to be inadequate adaptation and there'll be residual impacts, but you can bring down the impacts very considerably by better preparation. So good adaptation is minimizing loss and damage, and then unfortunately, loss and damage is going to happen, and then we have to address it once it happens. And one of the big issues in this, and I'll close with this, is between what we call economic loss and damage and non-economic loss and damage. Economic is easy to understand in monetary terms, how much money will be needed to reconstruct. Non-economic includes psychological changes, mental stress, cultural losses, biodiversity losses, etc. These are more difficult to understand and sometimes more important, but they're not monetary. They cannot be monetized. The other big divide between what is the different kinds of loss and damage is what we call rapid onset, like floods and hurricanes and cyclones, and slow onset, like sea level rise, slowly happening. And unfortunately, slow onset and sea level rise is going to drive displacement of people, as Achala said. People are going to be displaced, and that we are something we are not ready for. We talk about migration now, but the order of magnitude of migration from climate change is going to be much, much bigger. And we need to be ready for that. And that is something that at the regional scale in Asia Pacific, we will suffer from it, countries will suffer from it, and all of us need to be working together to help it. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Salim. That was a great intervention. Yesterday, I had a meeting with permanent representatives of the United Nations in New York, and I was attending a meeting online. And one of the points made by one of the ambassadors was that if we were taking a test on climate change and scientists were marking our test, we would immediately get a fail result, F mark, and that it is going beyond recoverable now, and even repeating the exam would not, at this scale and speed, we would not be able to really recover from the situation that we are in. Salim, I do have some questions, but I'm not going to ask now because I want to bring in some diversity. And if you do have questions, please keep them until the other two speakers have spoken. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Kamphasong Kamvin. He is the Deputy Director of Adaptation Division in Lao PDR Department of Climate Change and Ministry of Climate Change, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, Department of Climate Change. He leads the climate change adaptation sector, particularly focusing on building urban resilience through ecosystem-based adaptation. He supports the national focal point to UNFCCC and also the Adaptation Fund in collaborating with partners and relevant ministries. He has a master's degree in environmental sciences from the University of Tsukuba, Japan, and got it in 2020. Mr. Kamvin, you have the floor. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for giving me opportunity to share some of the example of loss and damage of Lao PDR, and also I will share about the point of view that what kind of frameworks, regulation that we apply to cope with the climate change, and what we are going to do with the climate action, especially for our case, Lao PDR. All right, all the guests, so let me start sharing my presentation. Is here, first thing, I will share about the overview of Lao PDR and then followed by the institutional arrangements and policy, then action plan, and what we are going to do. Okay, so as some people already know that Lao PDR is one of the most vulnerable countries, especially in the rural area. Like we are very vulnerable. We somehow we don't know how to react to the climate change impact or to the disaster. When disaster come, we just let it come and let it affect to our life. So this kind of thing happened to rural area of my country. And over the last decade, the Lao PDR faced with the amount of loss of economic from disaster event, especially during the year 2009 or 11 or 18. This is the big example that we have much effect from the disaster, especially flooding. And we also did the PDNA, post-disaster need assessment. This kind of thing can give us a rough number what we have lost and what's the damage. But we lack of support or assistance to recover it. So this is the situation of our country. And while Lao PDR, we contribute around 0.3% of global greenhouse gas emission. But what we have impacted is more than that. But we cannot avoid it. But of course, Lao joined the global community to face with the climate change. And this is the example of the impact that we have got. This is the happened in the southern part of Laos in the year 2022, last year. So it cost a lot, millions of US dollars. And of course, more than 50,000 families were affected from this disaster. So this shows that we also have the impact from climate change. Even we don't have any border share with the sea, we are a landlocked country, but when like a typhoon or storm comes, we also get affected. Then this is about what we commit to combat the climate change. Yeah, we joined the Paris Agreement, and we also try to mainstream the climate action into the National Social Development Plan. And yes, we have NDC as well, the nationally determined contribution. And we aim to the target to net zero emission into 2050. And to translate the NDC into action, we still need some support resource to implement this kind of thing. So come to the institutional arrangements. So we have the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment to be the central of the coordination about the climate work within the country and with the local authority, the life ministries. And we also develop the policy strategy to combat to the climate change. And under the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, we have the Department of Climate Change, which is my department. And the Department of Climate Change also acts as the assistant to the focal point for the UNFCCC and to track the progress of NDC implementation. And also we are now formulating the National Adaptation Plan, or NAP. So when we talk more about specifically about the Department of Climate Change, so the department is working with the domestic or international or any counterpart in terms of climate change. And last year, we have amended the mandate of the department, and we include the responsibilities of loss and damage into our mandate. And yes, we will have loss and damage into our responsibility of the department. This is quite new for us, but we have it for a long time, but just see it important and is new already. And for the policy, the government of Laos established the National Disaster Prevention and Control Committee in the year 2013, maybe 10 years already. But this committee is still active, and when a disaster comes, this committee acts first as a ad hoc. And the members of the committee consist of representatives from relevant ministries, especially the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, Labor, Social Welfare, Education, Ministry of Health, or Ministry of Transportation. This kind of ministry include in the member of the committee, and with the committee chaired by the Vice Prime Minister. For the implementation or the development of the policy, so we established the comprehensive policy framework to respond to challenges, to respond to climate action. For example, we have the NDC. So this time, so far, we are implement the second NDC, and we will do the revise in 2024. And now in the implementation of the National Socio-Economic Development Plan, only the ninth national plan. And we are following the green growth strategy. And of course, this year, just new, the government just adopted the national strategy on climate change. But there is a thing is ongoing is the long-term low emission development strategy is being finalized and will be endorsed, I think, in the end of this year or maybe the beginning of next year. So there are many policy, there are many regulation frameworks that are being developed in my country, but all the things was developed by the Department of Climate Change, along with another relevant department from different ministries. And then we will get it endorsed by the government. And there are many regulations endorsed already, and this can be downloaded via the link I give here. And for the action plan for Laopedia, because as I mentioned that Laopedia is the member of the UNFCCC. So every year we attend the conference of the party or COP, and the previous one, COP 26, 27, was quite important for us, and we have the action plan after the outcome of these COPs. For example, we will be strengthening the cooperation and engage with the national stakeholders and all the relevant sectors to implement the Paris Agreement. And we will establish the National Steering Committee on Climate Change. Now we are in the process of establish this committee, because this committee will come and endorse and will look after in overall of every program, every project related to climate change. And we will finalize the strategy on climate change, and they update the National Socio-Economic Development Plan. This one is also important because the plan is try to mainstream, to engage the climate change, or especially the climate adaptation into the national, into the local, or into the community development plan, also in the sectoral plans. So to ensure that every level, every sector consider about the climate change, consider about how to adapt to climate, because it's very important. But not just adaptation, they will also consider about the loss and damage, because if, like Professor Hak said, adaptation cannot make everything zero, but we need also loss and damage. So I agree with him. And also, Lao will continue to participate to the consultation of the party of UNFCCC. Yeah, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, as the national focal point for this convention, will continue to strengthen, to cooperate, to engage, and to have all the sector to get engaged into the climate change in Laopedia. And like we have just went to the COP26 last 2 years, and the country also agree with the Forest and Land Use and Clean Energy Declaration. And also the last COP27, so we will have continued to create the long-term emission on development and strategy. And also the loss and damage just includes into our mandate, and it will become more specific about that. And in the future COP, we would contribute to discuss, to negotiate about the barriers or gap that can make every way to try to get the climate change into our plan. This is very important, and it is the priority for our development plan to have the climate change into the plan. Yes, of course, we also have challenges, gaps, and like the institutional capacity is still lack of capacity. So especially the coordination or the understanding of this kind of work. Not just only the community or local area that doesn't understand fully, but also the central government, somehow they don't understand what the climate change and how to deal with it. They just say it's just no more thing that happen, but they don't realize that what climate change will give a very big impact in the future. So this kind of thing is still challenge for us to work with the related sector. And the human resource is also limited for this work. And the coordination between government, private sector, we still need to strengthen this kind of mechanism as well. And one more thing can be very important is about the climate finance, because we lack of support, we cannot do much thing. We can do just only few things within our capacity. And even though we have many challenges, but we still have opportunities. Like we have potential to get involved into the network about the loss and damage under the Basel International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And we may have to request the assistance for relevant, for example, to come to minimize the loss and damage. And we will need the support to, or we will contribute to the discussion on loss and damage, which ongoing the consultation to identify the gaps, to identify the what we are going to deal with it. And of course, we will engage with the civil society, with the private sector, with the business, and with all the relevant agency partners to be together to fight and to combat the climate change, how to reduce the impact, how to reduce the loss and damage. This is very important, because when disaster happened, we have losses, we have damage. Even though we have the strategy, the plan to adapt, to mitigate, but we don't have resources to recovery, to build back to the normal or build it back better. So there is nothing. So that's why loss and damage is new for us. And we can see that it is very important for our work, for the ministry and for the national plan. Yeah. I think I will end up my sharing here. So 감사합니다. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamini. You heard from our colleague from Bangladesh and also now our colleague from Lao PDR. What is interesting for me is the least developed countries are the most vulnerable and they are the most affected, even though they have contributed the least to the problem. They are also vulnerable and affected because of lack of capacities and resources, and that's what we keep hearing. But at the same time, they are the front runners when it comes to understanding the problems. And perhaps one day soon, the developed countries will have to go to LDCs, the least developed countries countries, and say, please help us to understand this problem better, so that we can also prepare the way you are preparing. So thank you again, Mr. Kamini. Now I'm going to go to Dr. Ranit Chatterjee, another champion when it comes to climate change and addressing loss and damage. Dr. Chatterjee is a visiting associate professor at Keio University, and he's the co-founder of RECA India. He's an architect turned disaster management professional with a PhD in environmental management from Kyoto University. He has over 12 years of experience in architectural planning, conservation, and disaster risk reduction in various Asian countries. He is also the founding member of You Inspire Alliance. He is a Young Scientist Fellow of IRDR, a CEM member of IUCN, and also an advisory member of UNDRR's Stakeholder Engagement Mechanism. Dr. Chatterjee, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Achula. And I first of all thank Korean government, especially the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also Green Growth, Global Green Growth Institute for inviting me here. Let me start with, we are living in a very connected world. And this connectedness actually is a boon as well as a risk, because the risk has gone beyond the boundaries. And so we have to think ahead. We have to think, we have to be futuristic to manage this risk. And especially for this region, which is the fastest growing economic region in the world, the Asia-Pacific region, the whole growth is, or the economic growth is through the private sector, which the private sector is making around 75% of the investment in this, in the national investments in different economies. And along with it, this region is also the most, or the hotspot of climate change-induced hazards, as well as disaster events. Many of the countries over the past have focused on reducing the loss of life. But what has been a concern now is how do you reduce the economic loss? And that's where the whole, it has started percolating not only for the developed nations, the least developed nations, but also already developing nations, because those are the ones which are fastest in growth. And how do you maintain that growth? How do you maintain that stability in growth? And that's where the private sector comes a big way. When I talk about damage and loss is not a new concept. It has been there. It has been a reactive action in the past. After every big event, the government would go do a damage and loss assessment, and based on that, they would plan a recovery, they could do a recovery planning. What has changed now is that reactive action has now been thought from the angle of how can we make it more proactive? How can we think before anything happens, and how do we take action? So that's where, if you look at all the global policies and dialogues happening, you would find that damage and loss is one of the major concerns. Where you talk about Sendai framework, whether you talk about Paris Agreement, or the recent COP27, where the damages loss fund was established. So it is catching up as a major concern. And while this is catching up as a major concern, but where we possibly are lacking is how do we bring in the private sector? Because the private sector still is like an invisible player in this arena. And every government is very interested to get the revenues out of the private sector. The governments are now very happy to privatize all the services, and where the services are taken up by the private sector, they give a better service. But then how do you bring them into this arena of climate change, disaster management has been a challenge. Because for the private sector, what drives them is business, profit. And how do you make profit when it comes to disaster management and climate change? And within the private sector, I think when the most of the global policies has started talking about private sector, but if you look at the policies, you would read private sector. But private sector is not a homogeneous entity. Private sector within itself is very heterogeneous. And if you look at the private sector, it keeps on varying from one nation to the other. And especially, say, for example, if I look within the private sector, the micro, small, medium enterprises, which is MSME, each nation within Asia Pacific has a different definition for the private sector, for the MSMEs. And that's how diversified it is. And if you look at the MSMEs as the backbone of economy in Asia, you would find that every country, at least on an average, is having more than 96% or 97% of its private sector as MSMEs. And in some countries like Japan and even developed nations like Singapore, it's as big as 98, 99%. And when I talk about this MSME, it's not only that we know everything about this MSME sector. Because there are two parts of this MSMEs. One, formal MSMEs, which register with the government. The other part is actually a gray area, which is the informal sector, who don't register and who don't pay taxes generally. And also the government has no record of this gray, the people operating in this gray zone. So it becomes very difficult in case there is a disaster event. How do you assess the loss and damage of these gray, or actors who are operating in this gray zone? Within the MSMEs, again, it's very much layered. The medium enterprises would make up for 1% of all the MSMEs. The rest is all micro and small. And while they are the majority, they also provide the major job opportunities or the employment opportunity in the local economy. So these become very important for the stability of the local economy, especially after a disaster event. But unless we know about them, unless we know about their damage and losses, it's very difficult to actually make financial policies. It's difficult to make even in general policies targeting these MSMEs. If I look at the MSMEs, they possibly, if we compare the micro cottage, or even in some nations, they have started calling it nano enterprises, like Philippines have started calling nano enterprises, and another layer, they have added another layer. So within this different layers, the risk varies. And this risk is not very much limited to one region. It is now very well spread because of the linked supply chain. The MSMEs generally do not go into buying insurances. They do not invest in making business continuity plan, which has been kind of a major driver for reducing risk for the private sector. That was what everyone is saying, like you should make business continuity plan. But think of an MSME, which or a very small vendor, which a street vendor, like this whole scale of MSME. You can find small companies. It can also be those street vendors who are selling food on the street. And can you imagine a street vendor making a business continuity plan? It's not possible. So that's where their capacities are very limited. Their resources are very limited. Their expertise is very limited. But when it comes to making policies for them, we possibly look at private sector and then look at the large companies and then make policies for the private sector. And also, because of this knowledge gap that we have, we generally are not able to address their specific needs at the local level. But at the local level, these MSMEs are very important because their resources, they draw resources from the from the ecosystem services, and also they ensure that the cultural continuity, the cultural heritage is maintained. And that's where it's just not about their economic damage or their economic continuity, but also about their cultural continuity of the society, which is linked to the survival of the MSMEs. When it comes to the damage and loss data for the MSMEs, we generally find that in most cases, for the damage and loss data actually looks at the economic or physical damage. But what generally is not looked into is the environment and socio-cultural damage which can actually be linked to the MSMEs. Say, for example, and this is something which I would relate back to what happened in COVID. Like during COVID, it was a very prolonged period, and a lot of this small-scale industries stopped their business. So once the income source is broken, that itself has a mental health impact, that has an impact on the education, that has an impact on the household. So it's not just about the economy, but also it percolates down to the non-economic impacts, and it goes down to the household. Because many of these MSMEs operate very closely with the household. It's not very distinct. They share resources. So when a disaster happens, it has a dual impact on the business as well as on the household. And in this, it is very important to understand where to assign the responsibilities of the adverse impact of the actions and who should take action. Because some agencies are drawing out, but the others are actually being impacted. So where to put the responsibilities, who should pay for, and whom for kind of the risk that is being percolated up to this MSMEs. Also, along with it is important to think about the designing of the short-term fiscal restructuring and financial aid and recovery policies. Because without understanding the damage and loss impacts, it's very difficult to kind of plan for this restructuring financial aid and restructuring policies. And this is something which I experienced in Nepal, which has almost 96% of the employment in the informal sector. But when I went and I saw the recovery plan, and I was asking also that how did you make it, they said that we actually did a consensus, based on the consensus, we said that, okay, this should be the reconstruction, fiscal restructuring. And they made they increased the moratorium period for loans. They said, okay, we'll give you low interest loans. But on ground, what happened was none of this MSMEs were actually availing those loans, and especially the informal sector, because they don't have access to banks. They don't actually go and have papers for their even buildings where they are operating from. So there was a big gap, and that's why the whole recovery process actually failed. Again, the cost of mitigation and address the residual risk also is important. How do you address the residual risk over long term? It's because generally damage and loss is done immediately after a disaster, but what happens after that? Because this is, again, it gets mixed with the development trajectory, and possibly this has to be accessed over a period of time. And again, specifically in this slide, I would like to focus that when we talk about this damage and loss, we generally look at the impact area. But as I said, now the world is connected. So the impact actually is not very much limited to the impact zone, but it goes beyond the impact zone. And that's where it starts from the local, moving to the provincial or national, and then to the regional. And this was, and a classic example of this is the 2011 East Japan earthquake and tsunami, which impacted Japan. And then there was the 2011 Thailand floods, and both these combined actually impacted the global economy. And both these countries actually rely on the MSMEs, and that's where the whole economic damage happened in this region. And I think what we need to do is look at change our stances from reactive to proactive, where we look at using disruptive technologies, build robust damage and loss assessments, methodologies focusing on research, bring in evidences from ground to inform these researches, and also engage MSMEs in dialogues and capacity building exercises. Many times in the global platforms, the voices of the MSMEs are not heard. It's the large companies who speak for the MSMEs. So you don't know what actually is going on with the MSMEs. And also, along with it, is important to show that MSMEs themselves can be built on this as a business case rather than moving ahead, moving into just being kind of an actor and not contributing to the cause. So with that, I'll end, and I'll possibly come later on to add to this discussion. Thank you.
Just in time. Thank you so much. I do have some questions, but let me look at the audience to see if you have any questions, because we've been talking from this end for a while now. Are there any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Achala. Good afternoon, Salim, Kampasong, and Ranit. I think this is a very good session. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and views. As Ranit, you mentioned, this is not a new topic. For the past decades, many organizations have been doing a lot of recovery reactions. I guess one of the questions to you as panel is, if you there are a lot of challenges in terms of first, accepting the causes behind what is happening. And Salim, you clearly mentioned that scientifically we can see that this is climate-induced. So to what extent we can bridge the gap between the understanding of loss and damage in terms of related to climate and the commitment to actually help to address and be more proactive than reactive? How do you see that, which is linked to the topic of today's discussion? It has, we need the political will, we need the finances, but it also brings another question, which is, I think a few years ago, when we were talking about climate change, there were a lot of debates. People agree that it's human-induced or not, but now we know there is a growing consensus that climate change is real, and we need to wake up and address it. And loss and damage, to what extent we are seeing that common understanding and common agreement that this is a collective effort? Your thoughts and views on that?
Thank you, Mahamadou. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mahamadou, for that excellent question. So I'll give you my response to what we need to be doing and thinking. The reality, in my view, of climate impacts becoming worse every day, every week, every month, every year from now on. They're not going to get better, they're going to get worse. And so all of us have to be ready for that. We have to figure out what it is that we need to be learning to do and prepare for it. Learn about it by knowledge exchange, and then preparing by building our understanding and our capacities. Whether there's a global agreement or not global agreement doesn't matter. It's going to affect us. We need to be ready for it. So to me, that is the primary investment of all of us in learning about what it's going to do and preparing ourselves to deal with the problem when it's going to happen, because it's going to happen. All right? There's no avoiding it anymore. It's going to happen. To answer the question at the global level, the difference between past events, which were not climate change related, and current and future events, which have an element of human-induced climate change, adding to the problem. These are no longer 100% natural events. There is a percentage of human causation involved that is brand new. We never had that before. And that's where the global policy making comes into play. We have the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement. It was a breakthrough. All countries agreed we must do something together. They haven't done anything yet. They're still talking. But hopefully in COP28 next year or later this year, they'll come up with something. We have to hope. We have to help them. We have to push them to have actions that they can deliver to help everybody. But you can't wait for them because they're going to be slow. We're going to have to deal with it whether we like it or not. So it's a two-pronged approach, with the primary prong being self-awareness and generating capacity ourselves. And Ranit's example of MSMEs, small-scale private enterprise, is a very good example to work with, because these people are going to get hit and they don't know about this. All right, so we need to help them understand, help them prepare, help them be ready to the extent that we can't. We cannot solve everything, but we can certainly help them prepare. And that, to me, is by far the bigger agenda for anybody. And then negotiations are for people who go to negotiations. Not everybody needs to go to the negotiations. Achala used to go, now she doesn't go anymore. I still go, but I'm not a negotiator. I go and I shout. I don't negotiate. But we need to follow them, make them do what they're supposed to do. They promise to do things, but then they don't do things. So that's our unfortunate situation at the global level. But we can't give up. They have to take responsibility because they are causing the problem. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Salim. There is another question, but before that, I wanted to ask if any one of you wanted to come and answer Muhammad's question. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what you asked is very important. And I think as we are learning every day, that's very important. And also along with it, every day or every disaster event throws a new challenge and also brings in a new learning in terms of new risk, possibly something which we have not realized. For example, when again, I'll go back to this 2011 East Japan earthquake and tsunami. Possibly that was the first time when even Japan, which is like really prepared for disaster, realized that an earthquake can lead to a tsunami, which can actually cripple a nuclear power plant. And now many of you have heard about this term called NATEC. NATEC has been there for a very long time. Even when the 1999 Turkey earthquake happened, it was a NATEC. There was oil spill because of this. There were fires. But we don't realize, but now that we realized when it became a big event, it came to our notice, then we started involving actors. And so what I'm saying is, whom to involve is again a very reactive in our approach. But if we want to be proactive, possibly we have to think laterally. We have to do a proper risk assessment and look at the future to involve who should be involved rather than leaving those people behind. So I think that's what I would put across to your question.
Thank you very much. Let's take the next question quickly. Thanks.
Yep, thank you very much for the great presentations. So I have a question for Professor Huck, and that's about the discussion about loss and damage. And I read a lot of expectations about designing insurance as a major solution to addressing loss and damage, especially among the rich countries. So they say, hey, we're going to help you, and let's design an insurance policy. So when I was explaining this to my wife, she said, but I mean, Fiji or Samoa, these people didn't do anything to cause this mess. And then you have these people coming in saying, I'm going to help you, but I'm going to help you design the insurance, but all the policies, premiums you guys pay, I just designed the mechanism. And she didn't think there was fairness to that approach. And I have to agree a bit with her. So my question to you is, given this push towards insurance, how would you advise let's say a president of a vulnerable country who is trying to manage his expectations as to how much to rely on this foreign supported insurance scheme vis-a-vis putting his hope on this loss and damage fund, which might be more along compensation grant-based support. So how should he design his policies given these two options? Any thoughts on that? Thanks.
Great question. Thank you very much. Tell your wife I agree with her, by the way. Okay, so she has the right idea. So insurance is a very interesting tool and phenomenon. It's actually a pre-existing loss and damage fund. All right, it's a tool. You insure your car. All right, so every year you have to pay a premium for the insurance. You get nothing in return for that until there's an accident. And then the insurance company comes in and gives you some compensation. The same thing with your house or for floods. That's a very good tool to deal with loss and damage normally. And it's been done for many, many years. The problem with insurance is you have to pay the premium. You have to afford to pay the premium. And if you look at the insurance industry globally, only 4% in the world can pay premiums, the rich people. Poor people in poor countries can't afford it, so they don't have insurance there. There is no insurance in Fiji and in Samoa and in Bangladesh available to these people, let alone, pay it. Now, what has happened is that there have been attempts by developed countries to subsidize the premiums. Okay, so Germany is a big supporter of this. They had this big program called Insure Resilience, where they said they would provide the premiums to insure the poor people. But they gave the money to the insurance company, not to the poor people. And so if you're not giving it to the people who need it, then is that really worthwhile or not? And they got a lot of criticism, and they accepted the criticism. So now Germany has come up with a brand new program they call the Global Shield, which is beyond insurance. They used to push insurance for a long time, but now they accept insurance cannot solve all problems. It has a place, but not everywhere, particularly for poor people. And so they have now enhanced the program to include social protection at the national level. And the last point with respect to what should a finance minister in a developing country do, he has to be prepared to deal with the impacts, whether he likes it or not. The more prepared he is with his own national budget, the less the impacts will be, but they'll still be there. The less prepared he is, the much bigger the impacts will be. So it's on the finance minister's responsibility now, rather than waiting for somebody else to help them and come to whether it's insurance or the UNFCCC.
Thank you so much, Salim. We are coming to the end, but I wanted to go to Kamphasong very briefly, 30 seconds. Lao PDR is going to be the chair of the ASEAN next year. Is this going to be an agenda for the chair?
Well, that's a challenging question. Yeah, from my perspective, this should be included into the agenda because this kind of thing happened already. For example, loss and damage. We don't know loss and damage before, but we know what we have. We know what we got affected. We know the loss that we faced, and yes, we implement the climate action, for example, for mitigation, for adaptation, but we don't know what is already affected, what we are going to do with it. For example, hundreds of houses were damaged by the storm. Yes, we have adaptation. People should build more strengthened house. People should move far away from the river to avoid flooding. But the houses that already get affected, what we are going to do with that? We don't have this kind of approach to apply yet. And I think for related to the question, if we have chance to include the loss and damage into agenda, that would be a very nice pace to go. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Kamphasong. So this brings us to the end of this session. I want to say as the conclusion, the climate change problem, the whole problem now, as Salim mentioned in his introduction, has to be framed around loss and damage. Mitigation being averting loss and damage, adaptation being minimizing loss and damage, and then at the end, countries being very, very serious about addressing loss and damage. And at the heart of this whole discussion is people and communities, livelihoods, and our ecosystems. If we don't put people, communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems in the heart of our whole discussion around sustainability, this discussion is really not going to deliver much. And it also seems that we are at the very beginning of understanding the problem, while we are actually hit the hardest from the problem itself. So we really have to bring the two together, quickly understanding and quickly reacting, but at the same time being proactive to address it so that we can actually bridge the gap as soon as possible. So thank you to everyone. This is for Global Green Growth Institute. This is also a beginning of a long journey to work with our member countries, and we are really looking forward to developing a very strong loss and damage program for us to really go into and help our countries in their efforts to transition to an inclusive, resilient, and green growth model. I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Korean government and also the overall organizers for supporting us and also bringing this amazing panel. And we look forward to working with you all in the coming months to develop a very strong program and then start delivering as soon as possible. Thank you to the audience for being here, even though it's the late hour now. And we are really looking forward to taking this matter forward, not to be sad about loss and damage, but to be heroes in terms of addressing loss and damage head on and go beyond talking about victims of this problem. Thank you so much and have a great evening.